Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Behind Belonging. So, this is just going to be an introduction. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Let me just quickly outline the structure of today's episode, and we can take it from there. So, the first thing that I'm going to be talking about is what is the purpose of this podcast? What am I actually going to be talking about? What are the themes? Then I'm going to be going into a little bit of why I think that it's important to talk about these things, my own personal experiences, and maybe even a personal anecdote near the end. Obviously, this is not going to be the normal format of the podcast. If you want to dive straight into the action and see what a normal episode with a guest is going to be like, the first episode is already currently streaming. So you can just skip right ahead to that if that's what interests you. But if you'd like to hear a little bit more about the podcast itself and why it's important, then listen on here. So the base principle of Behind Belonging is that fitting in is difficult. And there isn't really a lot of spaces to talk about that. We live in a society that kind of prioritizes just moving on quickly onto the next thing. We're crazy overstimulated most of the time. It becomes very difficult to examine how happy you are with where you stand in life, socially, with your family, a bunch of different contexts. And because or at least this is my hypothesis, because we rarely take time to reflect on how we fit in, we often settle for less than what we deserve, or we settle for places that don't appreciate us, which is hugely harmful. The reason for this is obviously because we have a bias for staying within our comfort zone, right? For the most part, people don't really like change or don't like the prospect of change. If you're in a certain friend group and you've been in it for X amount of time, or you have a certain familial dynamic with your parents, with whoever, for a certain amount of time, the prospect of changing that, even for the better, is often pretty daunting. And as a result, we stay complacent. We stay in these places where we don't feel comfortable. This is obviously just one aspect of belonging. We each need to find our place in the world to some extent. We need to find the people who we fit in with, the places we fit in. And that covers a range of different topics. We're talking about language, country, personality. There's a whole spectrum which encompasses what it means to truly fit in a place and to feel like you belong. But we don't really talk about these things very often because we unfortunately do live in a society that kind of stigmatizes talking about your own feelings. So, I mean, that's my take on the issue and the topic at hand. I think that for the most part, there is a lot of people, even if this doesn't apply to you, because there is going to be people who do feel like they have found their place, have found their people, are perfectly happy where they are. And if that's you, then that's great. But I know for a fact from people who I've spoken to when starting this podcast, as well as just conversations I've had in my daily life, there are definitely people who fit into the category that I'm talking about, of always kind of questioning whether this is your place or whether you are in the right headspace to operate in this place. And I know that these people exist not only because I've directly spoken to them, but also because for a large part, I was one of them. I think that right now, I'm very happy with my social life, both back at home in Egypt and here in France, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, up to quite recently, that wasn't the case. And I think that a lot of people can relate to the struggle of kind of overthinking things, being a person who is always kind of questioning whether this situation is right for them. That being said, it is still very difficult for me to talk about this, not only because the context that I left back in Egypt still very much exists, and I'm sure that some of those people are going to be watching this video, but also because it's very difficult to open up with my story that I'm sure that not a lot of people know. In fact, like maybe my closest friends would be semi-familiar with. But I feel that it is important because I'm asking my guests to come on my podcast, to be vulnerable, to open up with their own stories. And it's not fair of me to do that and ask that of them without being willing to do so myself. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my own experience with belonging, just very briefly. Maybe talk about a story that happened last year and what I took away from all that and the reason why I'm doing this now. So my social life has not always been the greatest. I'm sure people who are very close to me know this, but there have been many times in my life where I've just felt intensely uncomfortable in whatever friend group that I'm in, not for any reason or anything against those people or any people in particular, actually, for that matter. But there's such a small probability that the people who you're hanging out with are the ones who make you most comfortable, just because a lot of the times the first friend group we hang out with is the one we stay with, or there's only so many people in your immediate school or in your immediate gym or whatever it is that you use to socialize. The odds that you find your people in such a small scope, it's pretty small. But obviously you don't keep that in mind when you're in those contexts. And I certainly didn't. So when I found myself in a place where I didn't feel like I belonged that much, I began attributing it to my own deficiencies. I began to ask myself, why am I not enough? Why can I not socialize in the same way that these other people can? Is it something to do with the way I speak? Is it something to do with the way I think, with the way I look? And obviously, in retrospect, these thoughts are a little bit silly, and the only reason I'm really able to talk about them so comfortably now is because I'm over them, and I thank God for that. But the thoughts are still very much real. They still very much occupied a very large proportion of my life. And I want to talk about a moment that was kind of the epitome of all this. So I just finished my IB exams, so like my end of high school exams and that kind of thing. And my friends were holding a party to celebrate. Obviously, this was like a big accomplishment for us. We felt like we were ruling the fucking world. And so we were all very happy, right? We head to this friend's house to celebrate, and the stress of the exams is finally wearing off and everything feels fine. But I remember just feeling so empty because first of all, because I knew that the exams were occupying so much of my brain that I didn't really have time to think about what my life was like outside of exams. So the second they finished, it was a little bit of like a shock for me where I had a lot of reflection just at once. And then also because at this party, I just felt like violently out of place. I was trying to socialize. I was trying to, keep a positive attitude, but really I was struggling to do so. I just felt like there was so much love in the room for one another, And I just felt so little of it coming in my direction. Whether or not that was intentional, I sincerely doubt that it was intentional. But when you're in those situations, it becomes very difficult to distinguish whether somebody's intentionally leaving you out or you're just overthinking it. And that led to me kind of breaking down. I went to the bathroom, closed the door behind me, damn near broke down in tears. And that's obviously difficult to admit, but I feel like it's necessary to illustrate the point that I was really at like a low. I felt like even though I had friends outside of the people at this party, and even though I had family who loved me and all these things, in that moment, I felt like the biggest piece of shit in the world. And there's no reason to feel like that. I feel like now, a couple of months after, when I began to hang out with people who appreciated me more, I began to realize that, okay, it's not that I'm perfect, none of us are, but no matter what your vices are, there are still people who want to hang out with you. Like, there's 8 billion people on this planet. It doesn't matter how shit of a person you are, there's going to be people who want to hang out with you. It's very difficult to see that when you're hanging around people who don't. Once I realized that, like, my social difficulties weren't necessarily because there was something wrong with me, that I was just in the wrong place, the world kind of opened up for me to a crazy extent. A large part of it was just letting go of FOMO, letting go of the feeling that if I leave this friend group, or if I stop hanging out with these people, or if I stop making an effort, then I'm going to lose out on all these cool events and all these functions. And it's kind of silly, like, in retrospect, because the only reason that those functions should be appealing is because you get some kind of connection out of it, or because you enjoy hanging out with these people. There's no inherent joy of going to a party unless the people there reciprocate the effort that you put in with them. And that in itself is much easier said than realized, or than felt. But really, the only way that I found the realest friends who I resonate with on a deep level is through this litmus test, is through testing. If I throw effort at this person, are they going to reciprocate it back at me? Are they going to match my energy? Are they going to make me feel like I belong? And through that process and through repeated trial and elimination, that's how you find the real friends. That's how you find the place where you actually belong. I'm happy to say that for a large part, I've done that. But if I had to give advice for anyone in the same position, and this is going to be a common theme in this podcast, once we're done talking about our stories with the guest or whoever it is, and just talking about the advice that we would imbue on the people who are in the same position or who feel a similar way about a topic. So for this episode, for me, I'd say the biggest advice: never waste time where you're not wanted. Get outside of your comfort zone. If you feel like the people around you don't appreciate you and don't appreciate what you have to offer and the love you have to give, there's no reason for you to be there. Zero. There's always people who would love to have you around, and you should absolutely never settle for less. I don't care. There's no exceptions to this rule, for me at least. You shouldn't consider people your real friends if they don't treat you a certain way, if they don't treat you a way that you feel heard or seen. So that's it for this introductory episode. I hope you all enjoyed. God knows I could have used this podcast myself when I was in that position. So I hope that it can help others who are facing similar struggles, who are going through similar things. In general, if everything I've explained or the themes that I've covered today appeal to you, or if you feel like this podcast is going to be a help, or even if you just want to see me talk with these people about their own experiences and learn a little bit more about the people around you. If you're listening on Spotify, hit follow for the next episode. If you're on YouTube, hit subscribe. I want to keep this going for as long as possible. I want to grow it so that I have more and more of an audience that can finally feel validated in their feelings. So that's my only incentive for this podcast. I hope that you all enjoyed. I'm going to be hopefully posting every single week from here on out, because this is genuinely my passion. This is something, because I've gone through it and I know how shitty it is, it's going to be my number one priority to make sure that as few people as possible feel that way again. So thank you for listening once again. And if you want to keep listening, the next episode is already out. You can just skip straight to that. And I hope you all have a lovely day.